The latest word we get from the airport is that, quote, all hell is broken loose out there, that there is still shooting going on, that there's a report of a burning helicopter.
And the worst words I ever heard in my ear when he said, Jim, we've finally gotten clearance to put it on the air.
When I was a kid, my father used to say, our greatest hopes and our worst fears are seldom realized. Our worst fears have been realized tonight. They've now said that there were 11 hostages. 2 were killed in their rooms yesterday morning. 9 were killed at the airport tonight. They're all gone.
On September 5th, 1972 at 4:30 a.m., 8 members of the Black September Palestinian terrorist group easily snuck into the Olympic Village and took 11 members of the Israeli Olympic team hostage, killing a wrestling coach and weightlifter on the spot. 19 hours later, after heavy negotiations between the West German police and the terrorists, the remaining 9 athletes were killed at the First and Feldbruck military airport. 5 of the terrorists were killed in the fight at the airport, and the last 3 terrorists were taken into custody. The Olympic Games, both ancient and modern, have stood to symbolize unity and peace. In ancient Greece, the Greek city-states were constantly in conflict with one another. During the Olympic Games, they were obligated to declare a truce with one another in order for the Games to proceed. Essentially, sport was a substitute for war. However, with the increase of terrorism in the mid-20th century, the Olympic spirit was violated. This tragedy occurred as a result of West Germany's inability to fulfill their responsibility as the host nation to establish a sufficient amount of security to protect the athletes and spectators of the 1972 Olympic Games. In addition, the broadcasting rights granted to the newscasters by the IOC in West Germany were too flexible and in the end aided the terrorist attack on the Israeli athletes. When hosting the 1972 Munich Olympics, Germany's goal of the Games was to further separate themselves from the last Olympics held in Germany under a Nazi regime. In 1936, Nazi Germany hosted the Olympic Games in Berlin. The Nazis took advantage of this opportunity to show the world their belief in the Aryan master race. Because of these past games in Germany, West Germany's driving desire when hosting the 1972 Munich Olympics was to be detached from the 1936 Nazi Olympics. In an effort to create distance from the oppressive police-state environment of Nazi Berlin, limited security was placed throughout the city to portray Munich as a carefree and joyous city. For this reason, the 1972 Games were nicknamed the Happy Games, so that a correlation to the previous Germany that contained Hitler's despotic regime would be erased. However, since West Germany's primary concern was to not be linked to the Nazi Olympics, they did not prioritize their responsibility as the host nation to establish an abundant amount of security for the Games. For example, in total, less than $2 million went into the security expenses for the Games. During the Olympics, the open and joyous atmosphere of the Happy Games left them vulnerable to an attack. The International Olympic Committee denied the Israeli government's request for more security for the athletes. In addition, the fences that protected the Olympic Village were only 6 feet high and were not lined with barbed wire. Also, athletes did not need any source of identification in order to enter or exit the village. During the Games, the terrorists were able to exploit this weak security. The Palestinians were able to successfully enter the village by jumping the fence dressed as athletes. Olympic swimmer David Wilkie saw the terrorists climbing over the fence into the Olympic Village. He thought nothing of it because many unidentified people were wandering around the village and the terrorists blended in. However, this tragic and unfortunate event is not solely because of West Germany's indiscretion. The role of the International Olympic Committee is to act against any form of discrimination, oppose any political involvement, and to promote peace, but these responsibilities were not properly carried out during the 1972 Munich Olympics. In Munich, the attacks carried out by the Palestinians were religiously oriented towards the Israelis due to the long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. According to the IOC, during the Olympics, this animosity and war between these two nations should have been suspended throughout the Games. However, they neglected this responsibility and failed to promote peace between these two nations. Also, this attack was a political movement, which is another responsibility of the IOCs to oppose any political involvement. The Israelis and the Palestinians were in continuous tension in the decades prior to the attack, and the IOC should have been aware of this. West Germany, the International Olympic Committee, and the Israelis ignored their responsibility to show initial concern for the several threats they were receiving about possible attacks on the Israelis during the Olympic Games. When initially receiving these threats, both the IOC and West Germany failed to appreciate the other conflicts between the Palestinians and the Israelis that were happening simultaneously to the Games. The roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict date back to 1890 with the creation of Zionism and Arab nationalism. Both believed that the territory that would soon become Israel was their historical homeland. With the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, the Palestinians were abruptly removed from their homeland because the United Nations established Israel as a safe haven for the Jewish people during the Holocaust. However, in opposition to the Israelis, in 1964 the Palestinian Liberation Organization was formed as a representative of the Palestinian people. Since then, both the Israelis and Palestinians have continued to carry out attacks on one another. Considering the long and indignant history between these two groups, the IOC in West Germany should have responded appropriately to these threats they had been receiving in the weeks leading up to the Games. In addition, several police psychologists predicted that in 1 of 26 cases a Palestinian attack on Israeli dormitories would occur where the terrorists would scale the fence of the Olympic Village. Even after receiving this information, West Germany's government failed to act on further heightening security in Israeli dormitories. Finally, Der Spiegel, a well-known German publication, printed a story on its front page that the Foreign Ministry in Bonn, Germany had received a tip 3 weeks before the Games that a Palestinian terrorist group planned to attack the Israeli athletes. This intelligence came from the embassy in Beirut, Lebanon, home to many of the Palestinian terrorists. The federal government of West Germany and the state government of Bavaria, which holds the Olympic city Munich, did not appropriately act on the tips received. They kept this failure in confidence until 1992, after 20 years of the public's request. In contrary to the fact that several TV companies bought the rights to broadcast the Olympic Games, the TV companies should have immediately stopped their live broadcasts as the events continued to unfold. However, legally, news medias could continue to film the hostage situation in the Olympic Village since it was considered to be a news event and not an Olympic event. Although there were no restrictions, the local authorities and police department locked down the Olympic Village during the hostage situation, so photographers had to circle the village to find vantage points. These broadcasts ended up feeding the terrorists information about the Germans' rescue mission. However, these newscasters did not stop their live broadcast because by the power of the IOC they were entitled to continue on. The IOC is the owner of the global broadcast rights for the Olympic Games, including broadcasts on television, radio, mobile, and internet platforms, and is responsible for giving Olympic broadcast rights to media companies throughout the world through the negotiation of rights agreements. Broadcasting rights were first established at the 1936 Nazi Olympics. Specifically, during the 1936 Games, 25 television viewing rooms were set up in the Greater Berlin area, allowing the locals to follow the Games free of charge. However, during the more recent Olympics, television broadcasting of the Games has become the principal driver of the funding of the Olympic movement and the Games, has increased the growth in global popularity, and is important global representation and promotion of the Games and the Olympic values. Therefore, this granted right to the broadcasters is very important. According to Co Rentmeester, a former photographer for Life magazine published by Time Incorporated, all still photographers and broadcasters had to have accreditation clearances from the German Olympic Committee during the 1972 Games. In order to be granted accreditation clearances, you must request to be registered, and if approved, you are allowed to film. However, during the Palestinian attack, these broadcasters negatively impacted the rescue operations. During the first rescue mission, Operation Sunshine, the TV programs had the entire plan broadcasting on national television. Terrorists were easily able to access this since there were TVs in their apartments. Therefore, this resulted in several failing rescue attempts for the Germans. Ultimately, the news stations aided the terrorists by broadcasting the Germans' plans. In the end, these rights granted to the TV broadcasters infringe on the rights of the athletes. During the 2012 London Olympics, the IOC received many requests to take on the responsibility to honor the victims of the 1972 Munich massacre, but they continuously denied these requests. Facebook pages were created in order to encourage people to support the moment of silence for the victims. This is still a debatable topic today for how to remember and honor such a tragedy without offending anyone. At the 40th anniversary of the Munich massacre, a worldwide Olympic community wanted a remembrance in honor of this terrible tragedy. Although both the US Senate and England urged for a moment of silence, the IOC rejected the request. They argued that the reason for this was because it rejected the central principle of global fraternity. Many countries still to this day refuse to acknowledge that this attack also affected them significantly and will forever have a huge impact on the world and on the Olympics. The Munich Games have forever tainted the peace and unity that the Olympics represent. The sacrosanctity of the Olympic peace was shattered, and the Olympics have become a platform for terrorism subsequently. At the Atlanta Games in 1996, 3 pipe bombs were set off at Centennial Olympic Park, killing 2 and wounding 111 others. Security has become a top priority. Like in London, security expenses exceeded $2 billion and 237,000 police officers were employed, whereas in Munich, security was in total less than $2 million and only 2,100 officers were on duty. Due to the Munich massacre, the Olympics will forever be more vulnerable to terrorist attacks because it has been proven to be a clear way to get the world's attention. However, the 1972 Munich Olympics stand as an example of what can happen when rights and responsibilities are ignored during international events.